The ongoing conflict in Ukraine cast a shadow over the annual gathering of the world's top 20 economies. Notably absent from the G20 summit in Bali was Russian President Vladimir Putin. His battered image with much of the world was on full display during Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's video address to G20 leaders. Fallout from the conflict, including surging food and fuel prices, were high on the agenda at the summit. During their meeting on the sidelines of the G20 gathering, U.S. President Joe Biden thanked his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan for Ankara's efforts on the Black Sea grain deal. Biden also reiterated his support for Türkiye's desire to purchase F-16s. Erdogan also met with the host of the summit, Indonesian President Joko Widodo, and other leaders including French President Emmanuel Macron and Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So what was achieved during the G20's first summit since Russia launched its attack on Ukraine? And how deep were the divisions among the world's biggest economies? And for more on the G20 summit, I'm joined by Paul Rogers. He is a professor of peace studies at Bradford University in the UK. And Raffaello Pantucci, he is a senior fellow at St. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. Paul, I'm sure you followed the G20 summit in Bali closely. So what's your take on the outcome of this gathering? What was achieved there?
Well, it's a fairly standard G20 meeting at a very difficult time. Standout, I think, probably the fact that on the periphery of it, President Biden and President Xi essentially met quite formally for about 3 hours, and they got on pretty well personally. It's helped ease the tensions, but whether it's sort of hit at any of the underlying problems, particularly Taiwan, is much more difficult to say. That certainly was, in some ways, a high point, not of the conference itself, but just before. As to the conference itself, a number of things. Some things were missing. Very little really was said about the whole global warming problem. I acknowledge that you have COP27 on at the same time, and there was very little follow-up to the sort of the disaster that we've seen with the COVID pandemic. Bearing in mind that over 20 million people have died in that pandemic, more than all the people killed in conventional wars since the end of the Second World War. One would have expected more and more in preparations for what will undoubtedly be another pandemic. The other key take I would have is that there appears to be a sort of a fairly wider suspicion of Russia's behavior in Ukraine, and one senses that both China and India, key players, are putting a certain amount of distance between them and Moscow. And I think you see that also in the nature of the communique on this matter, which, while not outrightly condemning Russia, basically made some general statements which could be taken that way. So that is probably the key take in political terms. But I think some global opportunities were missed, as they tend to be in G20 meetings.
So, Raffaello, would you agree with Paul? Because China and India have shown signs of a changing attitude, although not directly naming Russia. China's president warned against the weaponization of energy, food, and the use of nuclear weapons. So is this a sign China is distancing itself from the Ukrainian conflict?
I mean, I think that China in particular has never been particularly warm towards the Ukrainian conflict. They've always been very careful. On the one hand, they have not condemned Russian action, and they've echoed, Russian talking points about the reasons for it. But on the other hand, they haven't also openly praised and supported. In fact, you've seen Chinese companies pulling back from Russia. You've seen a general sort of hesitancy towards Moscow. And I think that was reflected in the comments here. I think the Chinese clearly can see, and ever since we saw Putin's nuclear saber rattling a few months ago, that's really scared everybody. And I think including China and including India, who realize that, they're not going to condemn, frankly, what the Russians are going to do. And I don't really interpret them even trying to put a distance between themselves. I think they're just clarifying in some ways the line that they would certainly see as crossing as unacceptable, which is nuclear conflict. And they certainly are worried about the sort of implications to food and fuel prices. So I'm not sure I'd necessarily overinterpret and say this is really about them putting distance. I think it's really more about them clarifying that, they're not happy with this. But at the end of the day, both of them have other reasons for wanting to be close to Moscow. And that's about bigger geopolitical games. And those still remain strong in play.
But Paul, what's about India? Indian Prime Minister Modi said it was time for a ceasefire and diplomacy to come to the fore. Is it also shifting its policies towards Russia? What's the Indian perspective in here?
I think India has watched the development of this conflict pretty carefully. I mean, we're now, 9 months into it with no real end in sight. And from India's perspective, they were sort of fairly open-ended at the start. But you see a certain notion of caution and maybe lack of certainty now that the conflict is developing. All the signs are that, particularly with the recent taking of Kherson by the Ukraine army, that this will continue as a kind of violent stalemate, certainly through the winter months. And the longer this goes on, the more potential there is for wider economic impacts. So I think while Delhi is playing it fairly carefully, what they're also doing is making it clear through the statement about the need for a settlement that they would want to see some kind of direct settlement at some stage. That, I think, is a change, but not a huge one. Both Beijing and essentially New Delhi are watching how it goes and treating the whole issue with caution, but an underlying concern that is going on so long. And, of course, the uncertainty about whether suddenly you get a breakout of a more serious conflict.
So, Rafael, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan also held bilateral meetings on the sidelines of the summit, including the leaders of US, France, and Saudi Arabia. After his meeting, although the details of these meetings were not made public, but President Biden said he'll continue to support Ankara's F-16 jets purchase. So will resolving this fighter jet dispute be a possible stepping stone to fix relations between Ankara and Washington?
I think that Ankara and Washington's relations are very complicated and have been for some time. And they go in all sorts of directions. But I think clearly the decision to support the fighter jet sale will unblock things quite substantially, because as we saw previously, the decision to block that was something that did cause a lot of tensions within Ankara. And I think it signals that, the US is trying to sort of reach out a little bit. But, at the same time, I'd be careful to draw a conclusion that this was, a clean and positive resolution, and therefore all the issues that were in the past have been resolved. We've seen the Biden administration make a number of these sorts of signals recently to various administrations around the world that, they've had clear tensions with on the international stage. Saudi Arabia is the other obvious one. And even actually with Beijing, with the meeting with Xi Jinping, we can see the signaling from China, from the United States, is a desire to try to engage and show sort of positive signals so that, we don't have this kind of death spiral of negative geopolitics sort of dominating everything. So I think it's really about the US trying to put out a different broad message rather than necessarily us being able to draw the conclusion they've resolved any of the deep problems that still exist between, Ankara and Washington, or Ankara and Riyadh, or Washington and, between Riyadh and Washington and Beijing.
So, Paul, would you agree? I mean, on the other hand, do you believe that the Chinese leaders' in-person meeting with US President Joe Biden lowered tensions between Beijing and the Western allies? Or was it just a sign that growing rivalries could be contained for the time being?
I think there's probably a feeling both in Beijing and in Washington that it will be useful to cool the tensions somewhat. I would agree with Rafael on all the other issues, but this one is in some ways the most interesting one. And I think one has to remember the domestic circumstances in the United States. Essentially, Biden has come out far better out of the midterms than virtually any commentator or analyst expected. So basically, his administration feels rather stronger on this. I think that will be reflected particularly in further meetings at a lower level, particularly the coming one with Antony Blinken, the Foreign Secretary, the Secretary of State, pardon me, which I think will herald the start of sort of rather more regular meetings. We can't expect too much out of this. And I would very much agree that, as with Turkey, you have complexity here. You have it also with Beijing. You have it also with Riyadh. And this is unusual in international affairs. Normally, things are rather more clear between the significant powers around the world. It's simply not in that position at present. And we have the added global problems, which essentially are not being addressed sufficiently. So one has to be cautious in any kind of an analyst, and even more so, any kind of diplomatic prediction.
So, Rafael, how has Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's emergence on the international stage been received, you think? And what do you make of the Biden administration's decision to shield him from lawsuits for his role in the killing of Saudi journalist Khashoggi?
I mean, I think it's a triumph of pragmatism over human rights in some ways in sort of American foreign policy thinking. I think when President Biden came in, he made it very clear that, you know, what Mr. The Prince Mohammed bin Salman had been accused of, his responsibility in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, you know, was clearly something that was unacceptable and therefore placed him on a sort of pariah status. But I think what you've seen happen during the course of the Biden administration is a realization that it's very difficult to operate in the Middle East if you've put Saudi Arabia on the naughty step and are kind of unwilling to engage with them. And frankly speaking, no matter how much President Biden tried to get around this by engaging directly with the king and saying, well, you know, we'll go straight to the leader rather than, you know, the prince, who ultimately is still the prince and not the leader, sort of formally speaking, you know, it doesn't enable you to actually resolve the important issues in which Saudi Arabia plays a really crucial role sort of across the Middle East. Having said that, you know, having made this outreach, we've seen that, you know, the Americans have also been a bit frustrated when President Biden went to Riyadh and asked, you know, essentially for the Saudis to do something about the sort of escalating energy prices. We saw the Saudis proving unwilling to bend to that.
Yes.
And so I think it's clearly a very complicated game that's still going on. But I think there's still a lot of people in Washington who are very alarmed and concerned by some of the things that we've seen happening in Saudi Arabia, but at the same time recognizing that, you know, there are other things happening there as well.
Yes.
And there are some other important relationships. And I think really it's a reflection of the fact that realism is kind of a dominant flavor, I think, in international geopolitics these days.
So, Paul, how do you think Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is navigating the kingdom's foreign policy?
I think he is very much in charge, and he has a very strong hand to play, particularly now because of all the problems on the energy front and the sheer capability of the Saudis to sufficiently influence, if not dominate, elements of the overall oil cartel to ensure that prices do stay high. And the Saudis see the opportunity to play a much more independent game. They're not beholden to anybody. And I certainly think that their response to Biden's earlier visit, where they did not do what the United States expected, is an indication of that.
Yes.
The Saudi foreign policy is complicated, obviously, because one tends to forget that behind the scenes, there is still this issue of Iran, which tends to dominate a lot of the thinking on the security side. And this is one area where, if anything, they actually need the Americans on their side to a greater extent than at present. So overall, the Saudis can play their own game. They have a great deal of power by virtue of the oil exports, but they do not have everything.
Yes.
And it's a complex situation. I wish one could be precise. One can't, I'm afraid.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.